Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. We'll have another week on Ukraine. The war has entered its fourth week, and lots of things happening. The noose on Vladimir Putin seems to be tightening as the United States engages in diplomatic efforts, including, importantly, with China. The war itself is grinding on with huge humanitarian costs. And as Putin finds that the effort to continue this war is being stalled, what are his options? Is it diplomacy or is it escalation? Here to sort it all out with us today are Carla Anne Robbins, is adjunct fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly with the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Carla's joining us from Connecticut. Now that I see the background, Carla, great to see you.
Thanks, Ivo. Good to see you guys.
Elise Labott is joining us from Washington, D.C. Elise is a contributing editor to Politico magazine and founder and CEO of Zivvy Media. Elise, great to see you.
Good to be with you.
And from New York, Brooklyn, in fact, Peter Spiegel, you as managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to have you as well. Let's dive in with you. Today, a phone call between Biden and Xi following on an in-person discussion in Rome between the U.S. National Security Advisor and the most senior foreign policy aide to Xi Jinping. The attempt here is to sort of find a way to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. It's clear that we're doing a lot on the military side. We're doing a lot on the economic side, but let's talk also about what more can be done and what are we doing on the diplomatic side. How do you think this strategy is coming together? And what in particular do you see as the role that China may or may not be playing?
Yeah, because I think the Chinese element is really important. And as you said, I think the call is actually going on as we speak between Xi and Biden. I mean, the reason the China angle is so important is I think we've been surprised, and I think politicians themselves have been surprised, not only in Washington, but in parliaments throughout Europe and in other countries at the enthusiasm of their voters for hard sanctions, even up into including oil and gas, right? Remember week one, Biden was saying, we're not going to touch oil and gas. We don't want to harm our people. We just want to harm the Russians. And that certainly was the view in Europe, particularly in Germany, where they were hugely reliant on oil and gas from Russia. But suddenly we seem to have crossed that Rubicon and we're keep going, even though that we had oil at $130, $140 a barrel. So in the West, surprisingly united on tightening the noose, as you said, economically and commercially. Militarily, again, up and to the point of providing fighter jets or a no-fly zone, there seems to be a willingness to provide almost every other material to the Ukrainians. And again, even countries that we thought would not contribute, like the Germans, are now on board. The Germans have announced, surprisingly, they're going to double their military spending, and sort of we've seen a bit of a moment in Germany post-war that they're now turning into sort of a bit of a normal country when it comes to military. So on the Western sort of flank, surprising aggressiveness and unanimity, which leaves us with the Chinese, which we reported and other news organizations reported seem to be willing to aid the Russians both economically and slightly unnervingly militarily. The U.S. sent cables to all its allies in Europe and Asia saying we have intelligence that says there's been requests from Moscow to the Chinese for help militarily, and the Chinese have indicated that they're willing to do this. Now, the motivations of the Chinese are to be speculated, but part of the reason clearly is they don't have many allies in the world. They need allies. The U.S. obviously has treaty allies in Asia, from Japan and South Korea and Australia to obviously NATO, and the Chinese need an ally in the global push with the West, and the only one they have are the Russians. And so they seem to be positively inclined towards this. It has slightly spooked the Americans. That meeting you talked about, I think, with Jake Sullivan in Rome went kind of badly. I mean, the readouts we got was very, very tense, very, very long, not particularly, all those code words that came out with, like about constructive and that kind of stuff. We didn't hear those kind of code words. So I think that went very badly. And I think that's why we've seen this call with Xi plopped on the schedule ahead of Biden's trip to Europe next week. So I think we really have to watch the Chinese role here. I think they are putting all sorts of conflicting signals out. We had the Chinese ambassador to the Ukraine say, we stand with the Ukrainians. Then he got slapped down from Beijing. They are struggling to figure out exactly where they should sit in this conflict. Because like I said, the Russians are the only serious ally they have in this sort of resistance to Western hegemony on the global stage. And yet, I think they've been surprised, as everyone else is, on the unanimity of the international community. And do they want to be on the wrong side of that? And I think that's something they're struggling with.
Peter, thanks. I think that really sets the stage really nicely. Carla, to reflecting Peter, my conversation with folks on the inside on the meeting that Sullivan had with young Yashura really went terrible. Apparently, he had no talking points. All he could do was deny, and that's why they have elevated this. What's your understanding of the debate that may be going on in China? Because we are getting strange mixed signals. Sometimes it's all NATO's fault, I guess. The Chinese foreign minister spokesperson came out today and said, it's all NATO and the U.S. fault. It's back to the Russian talking points. But then in other times they talk about sovereignty is important and the war needs to end. And how do you see the debate that is happening on the inside, and where do you think she is?
Well, it's interesting because the Chinese are still, for as much as they insist that they're a world power, they're really not comfortable on the world stage. And this is yet one more example of it. They're ambivalent. There's no question about it. Peter's absolutely right. The Russians are the only big player friends they have out there. They're certainly very aware of the fact that the Biden administration has been beating them up left, right, and center. And there was going to be a big national security strategy that was going to roll out right before this started that said that they were the number one evil country in the world. And so this was the big face-off. And then suddenly this happened. So there's lots of reasons why they felt the confrontation was there with the West. At the same time, they are profoundly, they don't like being out front of anything. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that it's really all about the economy for them. This op-ed that Peter referred to that the Chinese ambassador in Washington wrote in the Washington Post, actually, maybe you didn't refer to it, but is that, he said, it's all disinformation to suggest that we're going to support the Russians economically and militarily. China's the biggest trading partner of both Russia and Ukraine and the largest importer of crude oil and natural gas in the world. I mean, it wouldn't be in our interest to play this. And also very interestingly, went out of his way to deny any similarity between Taiwan and Ukraine. Ukraine's a sovereign state, while Taiwan is an inseparable part of China's territory.
Carla there.
Carla, we lost Carla there. Elise,
can I just jump on something Carla said very quickly? Because the one thing she didn't mention, which I think is important, is if pre-Ukraine, the single most important issue for the Chinese on the global stage was sovereignty. Right? They're always worried about Tibet. They're always worried about Hong Kong. They're worried about their country getting picked apart because of the history of pre-49, where there were spheres of influences. So there is an interest in the Chinese of not allowing the Russians to sort of, take apart Ukraine. And I think that also gets to Carla's point about why they're so on the one hand and the other hand. But I just wanted to add that one.
Yeah, no, Carla, you just your video went down a little bit. So finish your thought on because I think you were on a roll there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where did you lose me? Because I think I'm back.
No, you're definitely back. So you were talking about the Chinese making this case that they in fact they wanted to be that Taiwan is very different from Ukraine. Point that Peter just emphasized as well on the issue of sovereignty, and so they're kind of stuck. That's where you were.
I think they're just really they don't like being out front. It's all about the economics for them, and Peter's absolutely right. The Russians are their only friends, so I think they're profoundly ambivalent. And I think the feeling right now of the reading in the state press, which is really the only thing we get out there, is that they seem to be backing away a little bit. We'll see what happens in this meeting. And I hope that the administration has a good way to give the Chinese a bit of an off-ramp too, because they've certainly been in their face a lot. It sounds like the Sullivan meeting was very much in their face. I would hope that the Biden thing is a little bit softer because the Chinese seem to be looking for a way to back down a little bit.
So at least pick up that point, because I think it's really critical. On the one hand, you want to be stark in terms of offering the Chinese a choice. You're either with us or against us, to coin a phrase. On the other, Our relationship with China has this is the 50th anniversary this year of Nixon going to China, preceded, of course, by Kissinger doing so quietly. There's a lot of back channel room for diplomacy here. And we have a brilliant diplomat in Nick Burns as our ambassador now in Beijing. How do you balance this if you think about it from the US side, the quietness to try to entice them to come to your side, and the forcefulness publicly, as Blinken again did yesterday in his press conference, pretty much saying, you got to choose.
I think that's right. They do have to choose, but there's a way to make it more enticing to choose the US. And I think Carla's exactly right. But I think it's maybe accentuating the positive of what they're not seeing from China, as opposed to focusing on their rhetorical statements. Because I do agree with Carla that they are ambivalent. And let's see what they're not doing. They're not propping up the ruble. They're not allowing Russia to tap into the reserves of, the reserves that are in yuan. And they're doing something very interesting with their currency, and they're not helping the Russian economy right now. And as much as they need military help, they really do need that economic help. There's a question about whether they're going to send spare parts for certain, go around US sanctions and send parts for certain Russian aircraft that Chinese have. And I mean, yes, they're saying that they're not calling the invasion a war. They're not calling it invasion. They're going along with Russia's rhetorical flourishes. But I think it's just as important to emphasize what they're not doing. They also abstained in the UN Security Council. What that resolution wasn't going to pass, condemning Russia wasn't going to pass because of Russia, but China certainly could have voted against it, and they didn't. And so I think what is important for the US is, I think they always kind of go for the, very bold rhetorical statements against China. That's not how China works, and that's not how China likes to be treated. And sometimes you do get a little bit more with some honey or sugar than with vinegar. And I think, in showing the Chinese what's important and, not rewarding them, but certainly not, ignoring what they are doing and what they're not doing, I think would be really useful here.
I think that's an excellent point, Elise. And Peter, just to finish this point up, because I think that red line is on the military supply side, right? And I think they were very worried with the information they were getting over the weekend that the Russians had not only asked for, but that the Chinese seemed to indicate.
Yeah, and that's the reporting we had. That's the reporting we had as well. I think there was an expectation, because it's something that the Chinese have been doing before the war even, that the Chinese are trying to set up an alternate financial system that is not dominated by the dollar, that is, they're trying to pay, the Saudis in renminbi for oil, and they're SWIFT as a weapon is they're trying to come up with a different payment system that they could use. So that effort to sort of circumvent sanctions through alternate financials, that is not necessarily a red line. Providing actual support for military material in a hot war, that is what has really, really upset the Americans on this one. And I think that's why this call is happening today.
And just like very quickly, one last point. I mean, when you remember that big statement and at the Olympics, this no limits partnership, there seemed to be some, between Xi and Putin, there do seem to be some limits now, because China's realizing that Russia, although Russia was kind of the supplicant in that relationship to begin with, Russia is not the kind of, partner to take on the whole world community that it was a few weeks ago.
No, I think that's exactly right. Turns out that the no limit partnership has limits, right? And the question is, how far are those limits going to go? And how do you entice the Chinese to put more and more limits in it? Do you do it through public browbeating, which the U.S. is very good at, or you do it through quiet diplomacy, which sometimes the U.S. is very good at too? It's just a question of that balance. I think that's exactly right. Elise, let's stay with you. Because of course what we're really talking about is the war in Ukraine itself, and we, as I mentioned at the top, we're in the fourth week now. I think no one expected when this started that we would be in 4 weeks of this kind of fighting. The Ukrainians have been really remarkable in their resistance. They've also been remarkable in the degree of damage that they have that has been inflicted on them. Just to just the latest report on this theater in Mariupol having 1,300 people in it. And so far, only 10% of those have survived. It is truly horrendous what is happening. And yet you see a nation ready to fight. And I think not just has it been surprising in the fighting, but some of the other elements. They have deployed their president, Zelenskyy, as one of the most effective spokespeople to get the world united behind him. I'm wondering when he's going to speak to the Chinese Politburo. But also the Ukrainians themselves has been pretty thoughtful about how to conduct this war. They've obviously been spending time prior to the 3 weeks of an invasion to think about that. So where do you think we are, Elise, in the war, and what has struck you most on how this has been going up to this point, what the Ukrainians in particular have been able to do, and perhaps what's been surprising on the Russians not moving forward?
Well, I mean, I think that convoy that's kind of on the way to Kyiv that's been stuck for weeks now is really kind of symbolic of the way the Russians, we've heard it many times that the Russian soldiers really did think that they would come in and there would be flowers and candy waiting for them, and that didn't happen. And the Ukrainian forces have really put up a stiff resistance. And just the way that the Russians, I'm surprised the way the Russians have conducted the war. And what you read is that there's old equipment. The Russian soldiers seem, kind of disoriented. The tanks are generations old. Some of the soldiers are, looting houses and looting places because they haven't been fed. You wouldn't think that the Russian army would if they're looking to take over a country, obviously they thought it was going to be a lot easier and they didn't send their kind of A team of soldiers or equipment. And then I've also been, just kind of, as you said, amazed at not just the resistance and the way that the Ukrainians are doing this in a strategic way to protect their cities. They're not engaging the soldiers in the rural areas. They're falling back to protect some of the cities. But just the patriotism of, not just the soldiers, but ordinary civilians. Like every civilian now is, a participant in this war. And obviously we see horrible scenes of millions of Ukrainians fleeing, but the people that are staying, young, old, male, female, government, non-government, just everybody banding together to defend their country. And I'm not saying Americans aren't patriotic, but I just have never seen this level of patriotism and love for their country and desire to defend it and determination that, Russia may take over militarily, but they're not going to, take the heart of the people of Ukraine. I think that Russia, as we said, is having problem on the ground. So now they're going to the air and they're, doing this bombing campaign, which is really causing the greatest infliction of death, destruction. We see what's going on in Mariupol. You mentioned that theater. Don't forget, there were the words children on that theater, on either side of the theater, in Russian, to let the Russians know there are children in here, don't bomb. Russians bombed it anyway. So obviously they're targeting civilians. It's getting a lot more lethal because they're having such problems on the ground. And now we see, as they're having such problems, they're looking, more to really solidify the coastal area. And I think Mariupol is part of that. But you also have what they're doing in Odessa, and, that's kind of neighboring the whole corridor with Crimea. And so I think if I'm not a military strategist, obviously, but I think in the end, and when you look at what's going on with the negotiations, Putin is probably trying to solidify the area of the southeast so that he can claim that in the end. And so as he continues to bomb other cities and move towards Kyiv, I think he's trying to consolidate his power in the area where he knows he's going to keep it in the end.
Elise, can I ask you, because you sort of touched on two separate things here, which is, if you look, I think the Brits and the Americans have both said, basically the Russians have made zero advance over the last 48, 72 hours. So it clearly has stalled. And he's shifted, as you say, to this strategy of, I think they call it, escalate, de-escalate. Let's just bomb the hell out of all these cities to try to, and then also there's the slightly unnerving references occasionally to the nuclear forces and that kind of thing, which obviously gets everyone here rather nervous. At the same time, as you pointed out, there are talks going on, and they do seem to be becoming a little bit more serious. Now, both the Russians and the Ukrainians are briefing against each other. But there does seem to be somewhere that Zelensky's been talking about maybe neutrality, where, let's be honest, even before the war, we knew that Ukraine was not going to become a member of NATO anytime soon and not become a member of the EU anytime soon. So why don't we just acknowledge that? I guess my question is, it's an unfair question because we've all got it wrong of what Putin is going to do in the future. I just wonder, if you were presented with a stalled invasion of Ukraine and all you're left with is just bombing the pus out of various cities, do you think that some of these negotiations are serious, or do you think we're just going to see weeks and weeks and weeks of continued horribleness in bombing of cities?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to tell because you don't know. And people say Putin's crazy, he's nuts. I mean, at the very least, he's miscalculated. He thought it was going to be a lot easier. And I don't think he anticipated this level of sanctions on the government. He anticipated some sanctions. He thought it would be, along the lines of what happened in Crimea, which has been, damaging to the Russian economy, but not, didn't cripple it. So he's facing it on all fronts. He's facing a military loss. I don't think he anticipated the level of resistance from the Ukrainians that he's going to get. So even if he takes Kyiv, what is he holding on to? I mean, it's always going to be some kind of insurgency. And so if he still has enough, I'm not someone who thinks he's absolutely bonkers. He probably sees that he's in for a long fight. Maybe he is going to negotiate. I don't think he's ready. And I think, in the US, they think maybe he's trying to deflect, to see pictures of negotiations on, Russian TV and let the people know that we'll talk about the disinformation part, I guess, in a minute. But I think in the end, he's going to end up taking a lot less than he thought he would. I think maybe some part of the Southeast, and some kind of neutrality, with some guarantees from the international, some security guarantees from the international community. I mean, I was just thinking about it before this morning as I was preparing for the show. I know it looks really bad in Kyiv, and it looks really bad in the country, but when you see the prowess of President Zelenskyy, I think he's the more, even though militarily the Ukrainians are losing, they're still winning in the international community. And he can go to the table and drive a hard bargain, I think. I mean, obviously he wants to save his country, but I really don't think he's going to roll over.
Carla, pick up that point on Zelenskyy, because I think this week was yet another week, of every outstanding week of leadership. From the very beginning of saying I'm not leaving Kyiv to the next week of really rallying the forces at home, and now by his speeches in parliaments and the Congress and everywhere else, really putting a marker down and sticking it to folks, right, in a pretty direct way. It seems to be extraordinarily effective in bringing support for him, both material and certainly beyond that. How do you look at his leadership and the importance of his capacity to basically confront Putin and said, you thought we were brothers? Well, let me tell you, we're shooting at you because you're shooting at us.
Well, I mean, Zelensky's extraordinary for keeping his country together. No one ever expected from this guy. I mean, Netflix has released his comedy show again. It is an extraordinary thing for keeping his country together. But ultimately, what matters more than anything else is the way the Ukrainians have been willing to fight. And there's a synergy there, obviously. But the guy is an incredible actor, an incredible player. I mean, and he's got incredible people around him. I mean, if you look at the performance in front of the U.S. Congress, and this was like the man from Hope. This was like the sort of thing you saw at the Democratic National Convention year after year. This was Morning in America with Ronald Reagan. That one video that they had there that contrasted what Ukraine looked like before the war and the destruction there. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. And in the beginning, I thought to myself, this is really bad because they had a female voice translating for him. And you felt like it wasn't going to be Zelenskyy. I mean, it didn't have the evocative power. And then he came on after the video and he was speaking English and you heard him doing it. I mean, it was this crescendo. And then he did the same thing in the British Parliament. He talked about the Nazis' campaign of terror. He talked, about Pearl Harbor at the U.S. Congress. He went to the Bundestag and he talked about German atrocities on Ukraine and Russia and about the Berlin Wall. So he gave them a little bit a way out in this. I mean, the pacing has been absolutely incredible. That said, there are limits about what they're going to get. They're not going to get everything they're asking for, but he's kept his country together. And if they can pull it together and get out of there in the end, this is going to absolutely carry them through, because they're going to need billions and billions and billions of dollars to rebuild. So he's going to have to carry this through to the end as well.
Just
Lisa,
super
can I
quickly. Just super quickly.
But also talk about the information, disinformation.
I will. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the world before Ukraine and how polarized we've been, particularly in this country, I think what we're all talking about is, I think everyone is kind of, you have the detractors here and there that are Trump supporters and Putin supporters. The whole United States, indeed the world, really has just really been united around this. And when Carla says he's given, I think, the world hope that, we all are more alike in terms of our values than we think. Now, on the disinformation front, one of the things that's been really amazing is the Ukrainian efforts to combat Russian disinformation, but also just this whole hybrid war. This is really the first hybrid war we've seen where, there's a military component and there's a cyber component. And where the Ukrainians have been particularly effective is on the cyber front. In 2014, Russia, they realized that all of their technology and all of their relationships as far as technology were Russian TV towers, Russian cell towers, Russian radio. And so the Russians were really able to control their kind of communications. And so they've been building up their tech sector and really building up not just startups, but, infrastructure and everything. And I think that really helped them. And Russia, again, thought it was going to be really easy to just walk right in. So they didn't even bother to cut the communications. And that really gave the Ukrainians an edge in the beginning to communicate and rally the country and the troops. Now what you have is this Ministry of Digital Transformation, which is doing a couple of things. One is a robust effort to fight disinformation and try and get accurate information to Ukrainians about what's going on, because, at first the Russians were really just trying a lot of psychological ops to make them think that they weren't as strong or it wasn't going as well. And also into Russia, because we see that the media is cracking down. Number two, they have this hacker army. Okay, hackers around the world, a lot of Ukrainians, but around the world have said, how can we help? So now there's a Telegram channel. It's got to have like 350,000 people right now. And the Ukrainian Ministry of Digital Transformation puts in a target and hackers just take it. It's called the IT Army of Ukraine. And they've been able to take down Russian banks, other types of things. They have bigger targets, I think, the FSB. They're working it. And some of it is very effective. And, Russia was the king of cyber. I mean, I would call Ukraine the crown prince right now. And then they're also working with tech companies, and tech companies have really been helping in this effort to stop working with Russia and start boosting up help for Ukraine. And then lastly, they're using crypto to get donations for the civilian resistance. And so it's just been, while their communications are masterful, the way that they're kind of fighting this information, cyber, IT war against Russia has also just been masterful. And I mean, Ukraine is really a tech hub in Europe now.
Yeah, I think this. I think is really important, and at least your article on this in Political Magazine was terrific. It's just a new way in which this war is being thought, and it just is. It's one of those, how the little guys can really undermine the big guys by leveling the playing field now using cyber, just as they're using javelins against tanks. They're now using cyber against banks. Boy, that's
the future of warfare.
But it's. It's fascinating. And so I'm glad you wrote about this and also highlighted this, because I think it's really important for people. I don't think people really are following this side. We're seeing all the bombing, the very traditional way in which the Russians, basically a middle-aged siege mentality that they're adopting. Here is new warfare where people can really get back at the folks doing damage. I want to get to Carla on escalation, but Peter, I cut you off. So
I was just going to say,
have Elise make her point.
Yes, but I mean, I just was going to sort of support what Carla was saying. There was a very good analysis I was reading recently about Zelenskyy himself. I think people forget that just before the war, frankly, he was not performing particularly well as president. His approval ratings were in the 20s, and although he was overwhelmingly elected, the last time when he ran for president, he was not particularly good at running the country. And someone made the argument that having a TV studio actually run a country may not be such a good thing, but a pretty good idea having it run a public information campaign during a war. I think the other point I just wanted to emphasize, which Elise is pointing out, is we forget that in 2014, this concept of hybrid war was new. And the regime that mastered it was Putin, right? Little green men and the communication. And I think what Putin probably missed is that everyone went to school on that. Not only the U.S., which obviously has been much more aggressive in terms of putting out intel and countering narratives, but the Ukrainians themselves clearly went to school on this. And I think that is also something the Russians did not take into account, because boy, have they been bad. I mean, they've been on the back foot. They've shot themselves in the foot by banning fake news. I mean, almost every Western news organization has been forced to leave Moscow. So who is telling the Russian story? I mean, they have not been able to counter any of this in a sophisticated way. No one is buying these lines about biological warfare and stuff like that. So it's been really interesting to watch how much the tables have been turned in the last 8 years.
Yeah, and that's a great transition to Carla, because I think what we missed is that the Ukrainians learned some really big lessons in 2014. They've been at war with Russia since 2014. There's been active fighting. 30,000 Ukrainians have died in before the war started. In the East in particular, and they've been training, they've been arming, they've been figuring out how to conduct a war. And so we have this stalemate that Putin didn't expect it. Frankly, maybe even the Ukrainians didn't expect. We have it there. And Carla, the Western media seems to be, well, that means if there's a stalemate, we'll have a deal. Putin will have to settle for something. There's another possibility, and sort of talk a little bit about what you think, but we hear all these stories about biological weapons facilities that the Ukrainians may have. Again, the second UN Security Council meeting today about chemical weapons, about the use of nuclear weapons, because the Ukrainians are developing nuclear weapons, according to the Russians. Are we seeing the beginning of a further escalation beyond bombing cities to the use of chemical or biological agents, or perhaps even nuclear weapons? And if so, what do we do about that?
The administration has been weighing every step of the way how far it can go to protect Ukraine without provoking Putin into unleashing World War III. We know what he's capable of doing. We saw what he did in Chechnya. We saw what he did in Syria with Aleppo. And we see what he's already doing with conventional warfare inside of Ukraine. I mean, as Elise said, it said the word children on the side of that theater, and they don't seem to have, this wasn't an accident. This was intentional. And so, we don't know what the red lines are of Putin. We have been self-deterring. He has been using our humanity against us. We don't want to unleash World War III, as President Biden keeps saying. But, we don't know where the red lines are, and we can't completely self-deter because he's escalating every day. There's a very real possibility that if the war continues to go poorly for Moscow, or if Putin feels his leadership at home is under threat from these sanctions, from who knows what's going on internally politically, that he could keep upping the ante. There's a variety of nightmare scenarios. He could lash out even more horribly on Ukrainian territory. This false flag possibility that we've heard so much about. I mean, a UN Security Council meeting called by the Russians to claim that the Americans have biological weapons plants inside of Ukraine. That's pretty scary, because that's the pretext. I mean, he could bomb an industrial plant and say that it was, that the Ukrainians were behind it. He could, have an explosion inside a nuclear plant and blame the Ukrainians for it. Or he could go even further. And we know he's got chemical weapons because he's been using it individually against people like Navalny and against, in Salisbury against Skripal. that, is a possibility, and it's a very real possibility, and it's quite terrifying. The nightmares continue. Putin can open a second front in Moldova or in Georgia. There could be an accident, in which that you could end up hitting Poland over the border, or he could intentionally, attack NATO because he's so frustrated and widen the war itself. I think the question that you've asked, and I think that's not being debated anywhere near enough, and that you, Ivo, are grappling with and writing about right now is are we thinking enough inside the government and outside the government, those of us who hold the government's feet to the fire, about how we calibrate our responses as he escalates? Certainly, we can't completely self-deter ourselves as he gets crazier and crazier and crazier. But we do have to worry about World War III, and you have to have an adequate response there that one hopes that you deter up the escalatory ladder. But we can't just sit back and say, it's World War III at every crazy step that he takes. So I'm going to toss this one back to you, Ivo. You thought about this even more than I have. What do we do if he uses chem bio?
Well, I think this is the big issue that needs to be debated. I think that's and it's not, and I hope it's internally. There's a NATO summit next week, and there was a defense ministerial meeting on Wednesday at NATO, in which the focus has been on how do you bolster our presence in Eastern Europe. So there's very much a big focus on sort of enhancing our posture. But I worry about our line that says we cannot have direct confrontation between US/NATO forces and Russia because that is World War III. That's self-deterring. And does that line change? Does the calculation change depending on the degree to which Russia uses other means to inflict damage? Of course, once you get into that, if you say, okay, if people get killed by chemical weapons, you do something that you wouldn't do if they get killed by conventional weapons, even though the impact on the people is exactly the same. They're dead. And so that's the kind of thing we're grappling with. I don't see the debate there, right? I don't see the debate in the US there. And I think we need to have that debate and really think through, does the line on World War III shift? And I think that's part of it. But Elise and Peter, Elise, starting with you, when you do your reporting in Washington, do you hear people talking about escalation and importantly messages that we're sending to the Russians about what we might be doing as a result? Sullivan had his conversation again with Patrushev, his counterpart in Russia, earlier, I guess it was on Monday, in which, according to the readout, we said there were serious consequences if they use chemical or biological weapons. Do we know what those consequences are? Do we know whether there were specific issues being communicated to the Russians, or do we just say it's one of those, severe sanctions will happen kind of things?
I don't think it's going to be severe sanctions. I think that, I know that they're being very specific with the Russians about what they might do. I don't personally know what that is. Maybe Peter does. But if there is chemical weapons used, I could envision a scenario where those depots that hold the chemical weapons, maybe, or something like that is in question. But I think it does bother me a little bit, as you said. The people are dying, whether it's chemical weapons or not chemical weapons, and to make the red line of we're going to defend every inch of NATO territory means you can do anything but NATO territory, which could, as Carla said, mean Georgia, Moldova. We've seen that he's gone into Georgia before. We've seen he has, designs on Moldova too. And then the untold damage that he can do into Ukraine by giving him this, very firm line. I don't know that, a lot of people are concerned that he might, if things escalate, he might go into NATO. He's got a lot to work with before he even has to think of going to NATO. And so to go back to President Zelenskyy, who's saying, we're defending you. We're defending NATO against Putin because we're the front line. and you're telling him, as long as you don't go beyond the line of Ukraine, we're not going to get involved with you. It's a disturbing prospect. I understand that there's no appetite in this country or any other NATO country really to get engaged in a conflict with Russia. But I do feel around the margins that the idea of a no-fly zone, I wouldn't say it's gaining steam, but I'd say it's on a slow simmer. And I'd love to throw it back to you if you think eventually that's where we're headed.
Can I just throw the question back to Carla on Chem Bio? Because we were talking before we went on air. My sort of first experience covering the U.S. military was in the run-up to the Iraq War. And I, like a whole lot of journalists, got a lot of things wrong because I relied on things said by American officials about what the Iraqis were up to. And so I have a little bit of PTSD that anytime the Americans say the Russians are about to do things, now I got to give the Biden administration credit. They have been truthful and right up until now. But this Chem Bio thing makes me a little bit nervous. We've talked about there is a communications war going on all sides. So let's not be naive about the fact the Americans are also engaged in a communications war. And I think reporters, in many ways, and editors are caught in the middle here. We have a very effective Ukrainian communications apparatus going on, which we've been writing a lot about, which shows a lot of Russian tanks getting killed. Don't talk a lot about the Ukrainian troops that have been getting killed because we don't see them. But I worry slightly about this Chem Bio thing in that, again, even as you couched it, Carla, it could happen. It could happen. They seem to be setting us up for a red flag. Now, when Tony Blinken yesterday goes to the podium and says this is in the works, he is credible enough to me that we played it big in the FT. But can I just throw it to you, Carla, just in terms of a bit of on Chem Bio, how much of this is part of the communication campaign, and how much do you think this is real? I guess is my question to you.
Listen, I mean, I blew it in the run-up to the Iraq War too in my coverage. I would like to establish I was working at the Journal and not at the Times in those days, but nevertheless, I also blew it in the run-up to it. And
in other words, the Times really blew it. Is that what you're saying?
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But I think the thing that scares me in this, I mean, there's several things that scare me in this. One is, and you're right, I cringe every time they say this because I've got Iraq in the back of my mind. But one is that the people who are talking about bio more than the Americans are the Russians. The fact that they keep raising it, that's one of the things that scares me because they're really good at the false flag stuff. And so I take it a little bit more seriously for that reason. As Ivo said, they're the ones who called the Security Council meeting to claim. And if I can imagine them doing it, it would be really easy for them to bomb a industrial chemical plant and then blame it on the Ukrainians, say, well, that was actually a Ukrainian chemical weapons plant. A chlorine is a chemical weapons, and chlorine is also things you put in, a water purification system or in a swimming pool. So, there's ways of doing it. That's, I think, the first thing. And the other thing is when we talk about nuclear, and Elise was talking about this, is, Russian military doctrine, when Peter, when you talked about, escalate to de-escalate, Russian military doctrine actually talks about tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, you'd have to be pretty damn crazy to do this, but they talk about these things. They think about these things within the military. To me, it is unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable. But I think we have to think about it because we got to calculate how we calibrate our responses.
And I think that the U.S., when they say this is in the works, I'm not sure how much of it is actual intelligence, and it's what Secretary Blinken called over the weekend a tell, right? That these false flags that they play about biological weapons or chemical weapons in the past have been used as a precursor to use that. And chemical weapons were used in Syria. We don't know that the Russians were actually the ones using them, but certainly they have a very big military footprint in Syria, and we're cooperating with the Syrians, and they have chemical weapons. So how much of it is intel and how much of it is, just a pattern of behavior that makes one think that they're going to use it? It's probably a mixture of both, but.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I think we're all burned. Some people are burned because of Iraq. I think the other thing we now know is we did have really very good intelligence when it came to the invasion. We knew how many troops there were. It turned out they were exactly there. We knew which advances they were going to go on. They did exactly as we predicted, and as the intelligence community started to release publicly back in December. Lots of people didn't believe it, including lots of people who Saudi intelligence didn't believe it. But in the end, that's what's happened. So I think we're in a slightly different position than we were. I'm not ducking Carla and Elise's question, so I will answer briefly because I've been thinking about this a lot. I do think the line about when and how you come to the assistance of Ukraine to defeat the Russians in Ukraine shifts with the degree to which these kinds of weapons are used. And I think if a nuclear weapon were to be used, or an actual chemical weapon, or less likely a biological weapon, then I think we need to be prepared to defeat Russia and Ukraine. I think the line shifts, the interest and the calculation about risks and benefits shifts. You cannot have in the 21st century a country using nuclear weapons for the first time since 1945 in war and let them get away with it. So my view is you mentioned that. Now it's unfortunate that some other president at some other point in time talked about the use of chemical weapons leading into a change of calculation in terms of military response, the so-called Syrian red line. So we got to figure out how to talk about it, but we need to start talking about it. It seems to me publicly, because only worrying about World War III self-deters, as Carla underscores. It just sends the signal that there's things you can do for which we won't respond, when in fact, that's probably not the case. We would respond in those circumstances. Tough sets of issues, no doubt, but we'll be back next week with another discussion about these issues. In the meantime, I really want to thank Elise Labott, Carla Robbins, and Peter Spiegel for illuminating so much on what's going on in another very busy week. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back again next week for another edition of World Review. Bye-bye.
Bye.